Hello, New Providence Soccer Club coaches. I just want to spend a few minutes talking about the coach's tips card. Really invaluable resource. Can't take any credit for it. I list some of the people at the bottom who actually contributed to this document and who were part of it. Podcasts, books, you name it. None of this stuff is my own. It's all stolen from other people, but really, really invaluable tips. The way that you get to it is if you go to the website, Team Resources, then go to where it says Coach's Guide, and then when you go to the Coach's Guide, obviously there's a ton of things in here. One coach referred to it as the rabbit hole because once you're in this document, you kind of can't get out. You keep clicking on link to link to link. But what we highlighted right over here is one-stop shopping for a ton of vetted tips, and that's what the Coach's Card is. It's a bunch of vetted tips. So I want to rattle through just a few things about this, although you could spend a lot of time looking at each bullet point. To be honest with you, each bullet point probably came from its own podcast or part of a book or something like that. So I actually want to go right to the title. Just because you taught it doesn't mean they learned it, all right? So a really good teacher knows that they have to come back to a lesson and revisit it. And please don't be like I was when I first became a coach, and that was, we'd have, let's say, a session on one thing, and then the next day in a game, I'd wonder what happened. We just did this yesterday kind of thing, right? Well, forgetting is undefeated, right? So there are some different ways that you can improve memory from the player's perspective. But again, just because you taught it doesn't mean they learned it. So hopefully we can become more and more efficient with our teaching and their learning. So one of the things I want to jump to right off the bat, actually, if we jump down, if we go down to culture, it's the most important thing you do, right? You might be second in terms of influence only to the players' parents, like I said, in regard to the influence that you have over the players. So nothing is more important than a healthy atmosphere. You set the tone. And by the way, in regard to learning, Doug Lamov talks about this all the time, but you only remember what you think about. Right? So if you create an enjoyable practice, the players might actually think about it. If it's not an enjoyable practice, and if you're not an enjoyable coach, the players aren't going to go back and think about your sessions at all. So it's very difficult to get them to remember anything if you don't have an enjoyable environment. The next thing I want to talk about is culture of error. You can't coach them properly through decisions if they're not making mistakes or if they're not willing to make mistakes. And you set that tone as well. They need to make mistakes in the process. If there's no mistakes in practice, then you probably didn't set up a good practice. There needs to be some level of mistakes taking place, and you need to be prepared to coach them through those mistakes. The other thing that I want to talk about is culture of focus, which is also related to checking for understanding. But culture of focus, we want to demand of our players that they're focused at all times in practice. It's not easy to do. It's going to take a long time to develop that. But we need to demand that the players are focused during practice. And again, I'll come back to how you can hold them accountable for that in checking for understanding. So if we scroll up a little bit to communication, just a few points about this. Really, efficiency of language is critical. All right? How little time you talk about something is going to really have an influence over how much those players learn. If you're going to get doing a long lecture, the players are going to flake out. And then can you imagine, for example, in a soccer game, where the players really can only think about the soccer game? If then you give them a wealth of things to think about, to be honest with you, they really can only think about one thing at a time. So all of the things happening on the soccer field are a lot to begin with, and then you give them a list of things to worry about in a, let's say, a scrimmage or a game, that's overload, and it's not going to be possible. You're going to get frustrated, and they're going to get frustrated. So really also have efficiency in your language. The next thing is highlight great moments frequently. So many coaches, like my rookie self, would only criticize players or critique them when things were bad and I needed them to get better. That's only half the battle, though. The other half is when they did something really well, then we need to acknowledge that so that their body can remember and their mind can remember what they just did. That was so good. So if you're only criticizing, you're only improving the player sort of halfway. You're missing out on the other half. And again, if they do something well, other players can emulate that behavior. They can emulate that behavior, the players themselves. So highlighting things is absolutely critical if you want to rapidly accelerate player development. And again, like my rookie self, all I was doing was critiquing players where they did something, let's say, not as well as what I wanted them to do. And I missed out on about half of what was going on in practice when I was only looking at how to improve players and not citing what they were doing well. We've talked about this a ton of times, but try to be emotionless in your language. Let's say it's a command on the field or a command in practice. You want to make sure it's emotionless. If you have too much emotion tied to your voice, now your player is trying to read into what your emotions are at the moment. If you want to give a quick command, go ahead, all right? But let's say it's head up instead of something like head up, right? Now the player's got to discern what you're thinking about, what's going on in your head, what your emotional state is, and then the game's going on all around. Try to make it just emotionless as possible. When we go over to planning, just a couple things about this. These three, guided discovery, why, and mistake preparation, they're all really closely related to each other. I just want to talk about mistake preparation. Again, if your lesson is good, if your practice plan is good, there's going to be mistakes. And ahead of time, one of the most important things that you do as a coach is obviously your planning. Your planning is going to take a wealth of your time. But with mistake preparation, you think about what the players are going to experience, where they're going to fail, and you think about the questions that you're going to ask them to pull out what they could do better. So for example, let's say you're doing a possession practice, and your players off the ball aren't getting open. You know that that's going to happen in your possession practice. The players aren't going to get open. They're not going to move well off the ball. So you might have to talk to a player and address, all right, where do you think Peter wants you to be right now if he can get you the ball, right? You want to run through ahead of time how you're going to deal with mistakes in practice and how you're going to use guided discovery to pull those things out of the players. So the mistake preparation is critical. And then the last thing that I just want to talk about very quickly is these are all common sense, checking for understanding. What are some of the different things that you could do to make sure that players are always accountable for what you say in a practice? For example, if, let's say, you do want that player getting open, you could say, all right, how is this player going to get open? Cindy, can you tell me? And then she knows that she's got to be on her toes in every practice and paying attention because they don't know who you're going to call on. These are all great tips right over here. They're very easy to just, read one of these and try any of these in practice. One of the critical components, though, is remind yourself that forgetting happens immediately. As soon as you teach something, the forgetting curve already begins, and forgetting is undefeated, right? So whatever you do, you're going to have to keep cycling back to whatever your highest priorities are during your season, because forgetting, like I said, is undefeated. All right? And again, always remind yourself that the working memory of a child or of anyone can only remember one thing at a time. So soccer is so complicated, and they have to run through so many decisions on their own because they don't have timeouts. So here they are trying to process all this information, all right? And if everything that you do, if there's a laundry list of things, the players can't really remember them. Frustration of you, like I said, goes up. Frustration of the players goes up. And just keep burned in your head that the players can remember really one thing in their working memory at a time. So I'd be happy to talk about these in the future. There were a couple coaches that wanted to get together to talk about some of these things anyhow. So if you want to follow up with me, that would be great. And we can maybe have some other meetings about this just on a voluntary basis. And then one of the last things that I'd like to invite you to do is over the next several days, if you want me to laminate this, so I actually laminate this for myself. And on the back, you can see there is a QR code to the coach's guide, and on the back there's a field. So I laminate it and I put a little dry erase marker stuck to it. And if you want me to make you one of those, I'd be happy to do that. Just let me know in a few days so that we can get these going. And that's it. If you have any questions, you know my email. And pleasure dealing with all the coaches. What you do is incredibly important for these kids. Thank you so much.